All right, we were going to have Howard Kurtz on, but they screwed up their schedule. He's going to come on, what, next week maybe?
Yep.
All right, he'll be on next week. But I did have a previous conversation with Stephen Ide, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, Dr. Stephen Ide. He works on public administration, public finance, political theory, and urban policy. That's Manhattan Institute is the institute that publishes City Journal, where I sometimes write. I am a contributing editor there. Ide has worked on, his work has appeared in Politico, the New York Post, the Weekly Standard, City Journal. And I wanted to talk to him because he's an expert in homelessness. And I've just been noticing, certainly in LA, it's partly in New York, it's just getting so bad. And this has nothing to do, Republicans complain that they only talk about homelessness when a Republican is in power. This to me is something we should be, leftists and conservatives should be able to agree on, that people should not be living in the streets. And I just wanted to ask him where this came from and why it got started. Here is Stephen Ide from the Manhattan Institute. Stephen, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
The reason I wanted to talk to you is I was in New York over Christmas. It was maybe, I don't know, it felt like it was 5 below zero. I was walking around and all over town, and I remember this when I lived in New York in the 70s, all over town, there were homeless people on the street. And I thought to myself, this is not right. This is not right. And conservatives know it's not right. And leftists know it's not right. And somehow, between those two sides, there ought to be something we could do about it. So I wanted to talk to you about it. First of all, we didn't always have this problem. I mean, this is one of the things that really bothers me. When I was a kid, there were not homeless people. I mean, obviously, there were always hobos and beggars, but there was not this kind of villages of homeless people on the street. What happened?
Well, yeah, it was not a problem that we called homelessness. As you say, we had different terms that we used: hobos, bums, vagrants. In most American cities going back, the earlier part of the 20th century, cities did serve as kind of pools of transient labor for an industrializing economy. Cities attracted guys to come and work for temporary periods of time, and then they would be, the work would be interrupted. And they would congregate in neighborhoods, and neighborhoods started to form around the kind of housing and employment opportunities that service transient laborers. Like I'm thinking of the term Skid Row neighborhood. In LA, there's still this neighborhood called Skid Row, but there's Skid Row neighborhoods all over American cities. And then in New York City, it was called the Bowery on the Lower East Side. And that was a place where, single men, probably, high rate of alcoholism, who had, for whatever reason, had been detached for their family. These were kind of like the losers of industrial capitalism. But they had a place where they could find a room for the night at dirt cheap prices, these single room occupancy hotels, opportunities for spot labor if they wanted to do that, bars, etc. So there were these kind of neighborhoods that were just for what we might call now homeless guys. Those neighborhoods were dismantled as a result of housing regulations, urban renewal pushes, but basically because we didn't want people to live like that anymore. We didn't want these conditions to persist, so we got rid of those neighborhoods. So we spread the problem out throughout the city, as opposed to having it concentrated in one neighborhood. So now they're in libraries and parks, train stations. A lot of those guys would have been in the Skid Row neighborhoods, traditionally speaking. So that's why the presence has become more visible, as you say.
Interesting. And it also seems, I know that a lot of our psychiatric hospitals have kind of disappeared, and the idea of institutionalizing people, and a lot of the people I see on the street seem to me to be mentally ill. Does that feed into this? Is that part of the problem, that there's no care for the mentally ill?
Yeah, the process that we now refer to as deinstitutionalization got going in the 50s. The institutionalized population peaked at 560,000 in 1955, and it's been going down since. For various reasons, we decided we didn't want to keep people in an inpatient setting. We wanted to try to provide them with mental health care in communities. It was a disaster. Everyone agreed it did not play out in the way that its architects envisioned. And so, at present, somewhere between 1/4 to 1/3 of the homeless adult population have a serious mental illness, and that is certainly an important driver of the problem as well.
Okay. Now, you've been you wrote a piece in City Journal I don't mean to read you your own stuff, but our audience hasn't heard it. So I'll just read one little paragraph here. He said, during New York's bad old days, which I remember, during New York's bad old days, mayors got reelected while presiding over murder rates that look like a humanitarian crisis from a contemporary perspective. The voting public is now at risk of settling into a similar complacency on homelessness. We see this in LA. I mean, if you go down to City Hall in LA, there are tent villages there, and nobody seems to care. Nobody seems to react and be saying to the government, what are you going to do? You have been very critical of your communist mayor, de Blasio, there. What is he doing wrong?
Well, you know, the New York City has this system of homeless services that has been built up over many decades. You know, we got off on the wrong path in this thing a long time ago.
Okay.
There is, for example, in New York City, this right to shelter law, which confers on everybody the immediate right for the city to provide you with temporary housing that night. And this has probably pushed down the unsheltered population somewhat, but has caused the homeless population in general to swell, and has also caused the quality of services that the city can provide to homeless people to really diminish, because they're just constantly in triage mode. So, you know, we do have like quality providers of homeless services. There are good shelters who work to, like, you know, connect guys with job training, get them back on their feet. But it's harder for those people to do their work when there's just this constant pressure from the right to shelter and other factors pushing the population, the homeless population, up and up and up and up. I mean, it's a structural problem. The economy's bad, homelessness goes up. The economy's good, homelessness keeps going up. And you know, it's like the murder rate was. Well, it's just, you can't help it. We've got 2,000 murders a year. That's just the kind of city we are.
Well, then, I mean, like I said, as I was walking around New York, and I walk around here, and I can't help thinking to myself, you know, it ain't right. It ain't right that people should be living like this. Is there a government policy that you do recommend, a positive policy that you think would help?
Well, I think, you know, now it's more sensible to recommend trying to manage the problem, trying to reduce it, than trying some dramatic strategy that's going to end homelessness. There's been a lot of talk of ending homelessness over the past 10, 15 years, meaning mostly providing permanent housing benefits to anyone who's homeless. I don't think that that's a logical solution to the entire homeless population. For some people, you know, people with chronic mental illness who have no system of family support, yes, we've got to provide them we've got to accept the fact that we're just going to have to care for them for the rest of their lives. For a lot of the homeless population, you know, if they've just sort of lost their job, if it's just a temporary state, I don't think we need to be giving them, you know, a permanent housing benefit. But we do need to figure out some way in which, you know, to bring the rent down. We have a desperate shortage of low rent housing, certainly in New York, and also in San Francisco, LA. We're going, you know, these problems like serious mental illness, which is not a problem for all the homeless, but the hardest cases, that is also something that we need to do something about, so they don't make their homes on the streets, but actually, you know, make their homes in places where we can actually help them.
Why is it these essentially left-wing cities have such expensive real estate? Is it just because they're such swell places to live, or is it the way they control the rents?
Well, housing regulation has been a big driver of homelessness. If we didn't regulate away the SROs, a lot of the homeless would have a place to stay. A private landlord could tend to their housing needs as opposed to the government. The government is always playing catch up with the affordable housing game, because if you regulate housing above the reach of low income populations, well, then it's going to be more expensive for you on the other end to use taxpayer funds to try to build housing for those populations. Clearly, in the old days when we had these Skid Row neighborhoods, the private sector actually did a sort of okay job at providing housing for many of these populations. And it's very hard to say that government is doing a better job than the private sector did now. One issue we have is we have a lot of government subsidized housing. We have the enormous NYCHA units, the projects in New York City. Can't miss them. There's that is an asset that is, you know, possibly underutilized in terms of what it could do for the homeless population. There are a lot of units that are overhoused, people who have more rooms than they actually need, and well, at the same time, we have 60,000 homeless people. So we have a lot of affordable housing. We're not making the best use of it, the most efficient use of it.
What about, I mean, an individual, a church? People want to go out and, work in soup kitchens and feed the homeless. But at the same time, I know that a lot of guys are running games on the street. I mean, I've worked with the police who've shown me videos of people sitting in wheelchairs and then at the end of the day packing up their wheelchair and walking away after they've gotten a lot of money from begging. Nobody wants to incentivize people to be homeless. But is there anything that individuals can do to help people that would actually help people?
Well, I want people to be compassionate. I think anybody who's in favor of, civil society doing as much as it can for these pressing needs, you want to encourage people to help them out. And there are, worthy nonprofits. If you can find a good nonprofit with a long record of success, then, it's good to attach yourself to them, support them in any way you can, because these are groups who are trying to work on long-term solutions to this problem, dealing with, substance abuse treatment, mental illness treatment, job training. If you feel the need to give somebody, to give some money to a panhandler, then I don't want to say, you should shrivel up your heart and never do that. But, that's not, there is a sense in which that does make it easier for that person to stay on the street where we're not going to be able to help them. And it's certainly not going to lead towards any sort of long-term solution to the problem.
Well, then let me take it from that angle. If I wanted to be an activist of some sort, what should I be saying to the city of LA, or what should I be saying to the city of New York? If I'm holding meetings, if I'm organizing, if I'm giving money to something, where should that go? I mean, there should be. It seems to me that there ought to be a path forward toward eliminating essentially the kind of massiveness of this problem. I mean, I remember in the 80s walking out to go to work early in the morning, and homeless people were lined up along the Morgan Library heating ducts to stay warm. They were just sleeping head to toe along the heating ducts like mosquitoes on a tree, just the way sleeping in a chain. And I just thought, like, does it have to be that way? Is that a necessity, or is there something that activists should be doing to stop it?
Well, I think, you separate the problem, and you have to make a decision about which parts of the problem that you really feel like you need to address. I mean, one big driver of the problem is single parent families. Most of the homeless population in New York City, families with children, mostly headed by single parent families. That's a really tough nut to crack. Hard to know what government should be doing. But something like, the mentally ill, we made a lot of mistakes over the years. We can point to specific places in which decisions were made that made things worse and worse and worse. So yes, we need to provide them with housing. We need to get them into treatment. People who are resistant to treatment, we need to be talking about perhaps an involuntary, in a temporary basis, way of treating them. And so that at least makes the problem, as I say, more manageable. And, we know that we're doing more for the hardest cases, as opposed to, providing. Everybody wants housing. Everybody wants affordable housing, but some people really do need it more than others.
So my last question, I mean, if you could basically snap your fingers and there would be one policy that changed, that it would help this problem, what would it be?
I would focus on the mental illness related homelessness, and I would focus on connecting the seriously mentally ill with high quality providers who not only can give them housing, but provide them with case management and treatment to ensure that they will not be on the streets, potentially threatening people, potentially pushing people in front of oncoming subways, but caring for them in a way that, a civilized society would do, instead of the, I mean, it's great. We think of ourselves as very tolerant, very compassionate, as opposed to, former times. But people from the 19th century, if they would come to cities these days and look at these, people living in squalor, they would have a lot of questions about how truly compassionate our society really
Yeah,
is.
no, that is exactly what struck me. And I know I said that was the last question, but I just want to ask one last thing. To go back again to the actual government housing that is being used, you feel that you seem to feel that a private solution, that something like a SRO hotels, Bowery neighborhood that's not a good neighborhood, but at least there's people to live, that was actually a better solution than government shelters? Did I get that right?
Well, in government shelters these days in New York City, the conditions in many cases are truly appalling.
Yeah.
And we are spending far more on these facilities, I can tell you. I mean, I recently, in 1980, you could have gotten a night stay in a Bowery hotel for $3 at the time. It's about $10 now. You can panhandle that, no problem. It wasn't much.
Yeah.
It wasn't, high class, but it was a modicum of privacy, and it was a place to stay. We're spending a lot more than that these days, and in many cases, the results are not that great. So the private sector system, and we had a variety of private sector housing options. There weren't just SROs; there were rooming houses, boarding houses, depending on which city and which time you're talking about. So there was this kind of flexibility in the that the private market didn't have. Sometimes the conditions were not optimal, but they were cheap.
Yeah.
And for many people, I think that was a better solution than the one that government has been the solution that government has officially committed itself to since the 1980s, but is really keeps falling way short of delivering on. So you reach a point where it's like, well, maybe this is, government is reaching a little bit too far.
Yeah, yeah. Stephen, I thank you very much for coming on of the Manhattan Institute. Really interesting, just a mind-boggling problem. And it really, I want to hear more about it and learn more about it, because I feel like there's got to be some way forward that is not just having people living in tents on the street. Really interesting talking to you. I appreciate your coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thanks a lot. All right, Stephen Ide of the Manhattan Institute. We'll be talking more about homelessness because I expect to solve this problem by the time I go off the air, which is probably next Tuesday. All right.